Hello everybody, my name is Mike Gaudette and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I walk you through my 5 favorite albums from every year. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the year 1980. We have now entered a new decade, and seeing the evolution of music from 1970 to 1980 has been truly fascinating. Between the emergence and the further expansion of so many different styles of music, the technological advancements and the further evolution of the synthesizer, and the large amount of bands and artists that would come out of the 70s and would release some of the most classic albums of all time. And it was a time of peak creativity and musical transformation. And now that we've arrived at the 80s, we will see what sorts of new things continue to play out using the foundational tools that were set in place in the previous decade of the 70s. So I'm very excited to be entering this new decade of the 80s with you, and I look forward to seeing and discussing all of the great albums that came out of this period. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums of 1980, starting with number 5. Alright, coming in at number 5 is Never Forever by Kate Bush. This was her third studio album, and in my opinion, the strongest album of her discography up to that point. I think everything sounds more enhanced on this record. The songwriting evolves into even more stylistic territories with this really great fusion of art rock, art pop, as well as progressive and baroque pop. There's a wider use of different types of synthesizers, which is done in a very tasteful way, and the production is even more enhanced on this record, and this would be the first album that Kate Bush would produce herself, and I think that was a very smart choice. I think she did a great job on that. The album is 11 tracks long, and I think it is very consistent from front to back. It opens up perfectly with her classic hit Babushka, and from that point on, it is just one amazing and unique song after the next, with all of these tracks containing those core elements that make up that very unique Kate Bush sound, with the unorthodox chord progressions, the very precisely written instrumental background parts, the tasteful vocal harmonies, and the all-around very catchy and very colorful vocal melodies. Of the 5 tracks on side 1, my 3 favorites would be Babushka, Blow Away, and Egypt, which takes on more of a mysterious and eerie sort of tone and has some of my favorite synth sounds of the entire record. Side 2 delivers another 6 amazing tracks, offering all sorts of twists and turns from song to song, with my personal favorites being the final 2 tracks, Army Dreamers and Breathing, which were both singles for this record. And in general, I think Kate Bush reached her compositional peak at this point in her discography, and I think this was the perfect record to set up a really nice foundation for her to continue to build off of and deliver more incredible albums in the coming years. So that is my number 5 album. Now on to number 4. Alright, coming in at number 4 is Black Sea by XTC, another classic album to come from this English rock band. And in my previous episode of 1979, XTC had actually gotten my number 1 spot, my favorite album of 79, which was Drums and Wires. So this was certainly a very strong 2-year period for XTC. And on this album, they continue to build off of the sounds that they had established on the previous record and added some additional layers and textures to their sound with the addition of the piano and synth, which was done by their guitarist Dave Gregory. And mood-wise, this album takes on a bit of a brighter tone compared to the previous record, with more songs that are on, I would say, the groovy and feel-good side of things. But at the same time, there's no shortage of artsy and experimental tracks on here as well. In my opinion, the opening 2 tracks are the high point of the album. It opens up so strong with 2 back-to-back XTC classics, starting with Andy Partridge's Respectable Street, and then going into Colin Moulding's Generals and Majors. In my opinion, probably the strongest opening sequence of 2 songs of any XTC record, and it really illustrates how well Andy Partridge and Colin Moulding's songwriting complements one another. The remainder of the album features 8 more Andy Partridge tracks, as well as 1 more Colin Moulding original with the very groovy Love at First Sight. And I think it's a very consistent selection of songs that contain all of those unique and quirky elements of the XTC sound, with the very unorthodox and colorful chord progressions, as well as some very dissonant and very uncommon chord voicings within the guitar. And there's some very cool writing between the 2 guitars on here. We have some rhythmic parts that are very syncopated, but are done so in a way that is very groovy and very palatable to an untrained ear. Other than the opening 2 tracks, a couple of other favorites of mine on here would be Living Through Another Cuba, Towers of London, and Travels in Nihilon. Just such an awesomely dark and ominous track that ends the album in a very similar tone to how they ended the previous album with the song Complicated Game. And I love how they conclude the album like that. It's kind of deceiving and you don't really see it coming, but I think it just makes the album conclude in the most satisfying and intense way possible. So I love this album, and I think the late 70s and early 80s were a very prolific time for XTC, and I regard this as one of the best albums of their discography. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on XTC's entire discography, I did a video ranking all of their studio albums. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the tier list playlist linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 4 album. Now on to number 3. Alright, coming in at number 3 is Super Trouper by ABBA. I'm a huge ABBA fan, and this is actually my number 1 favorite album of their entire discography. I think this record is pretty much perfect from front to back, with not one skip-over song in this 10-song track listing. And in terms of the quality of the songs, this album is just jam-packed with so many classic ABBA songs, and it almost plays through like a greatest hits album. Stylistically, this album goes in a more straight-ahead pop direction, which is more similar to the styles that they had explored on a couple of albums prior to this one. And we still have some slight disco elements on select tracks, but definitely not as prevalent as it was on the previous couple of releases. 2 of the members of the group had gotten divorced prior to this album, and that would open up some more deeper subject matters for them to write about in their lyrics and show us a different side of them that we have not seen before. Side 1 is comprised of almost entirely singles. Like I said, it's almost like a greatest hits album, and I love every song on side 1, but if I had to pick one, I would probably go with The Winner Takes All. And then side 2 gives us a couple of more singles mixed with a few B-sides, and my favorite from side 2 would have to be Happy New Year. That's probably my favorite track from the entire record. And I also love Lay Your Love on Me, and the closing track, which is a live recording of a song titled The Way Old Friends Do. It closes things up on a nice peaceful and serene mood and is just the perfect way to conclude this beautiful record. So I think this is ABBA's most mature and most polished sounding record from front to back. It has the most consistent track listing and probably contains the largest amount of my favorite ABBA songs. And if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on ABBA's full discography, I did a video ranking all of their studio albums. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 3 album. Now on to number 2. Coming in at number 2 is Remain in Light by the Talking Heads. In my opinion, this is hands down the best record of the Talking Heads discography. I think it's a perfect record from front to back, and it was recorded during a time where I think the band was operating at their creative peak. On their previous record, Fear of Music, they had started exploring more of Fela Kuti's music, which resulted in some more Afrobeat influences popping up, and they would explore those styles even further on this record with the further expansion of African rhythms, fused together with funk and electronic elements, which resulted in such a groundbreaking and unique album for the year 1980. And the way that a lot of this album was made was that they would do these long, extended jams, and then Brian Eno would go back and edit and splice up parts together and add some stuff on top of it, and then David Byrne would write vocal melodies and lyrics on top of that. So this was a very unorthodox way of writing music for the year 1980, and I think it's for very good reason why this album is held in such high regard. The songs are filled with so many feel-good and tasteful grooves, but are also very interesting from a musical, rhythmic, and production standpoint. In my opinion, this is Brian Eno's strongest production work of any Talking Heads album that he had worked on. And on top of the amazing contributions from Brian Eno, we also have a couple of really great guest features like the guitarist from King Crimson, Adrian Belew, as well as trumpet player John Hassel, among many others. And I also love the contrast between the first 5 tracks of the album and then the final 3 tracks. The album opens up on a much more groovy and feel-good sort of vibe, with a couple of Talking Heads' most classic hits like Once in a Lifetime and Houses in Motion. And then the final 3 tracks veer off into more of that experimental art rock sort of territory, and it concludes the album on a much darker sort of vibe than it opens up on. The Overload is one of my favorite closing tracks of any Talking Heads album. That song just has such a great intensity to it, and is, in my opinion, the perfect final track for Brian Eno's production in the Talking Heads. My personal favorite songs on here would be Once in a Lifetime, Listening Wind, and The Overload. So I think this is a perfect record that captures a little bit of everything that the Talking Heads has to offer. Between the African influences, the funky elements, the art rock flavors, and the production work and use of electronics from Brian Eno. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on Talking Heads' entire discography, I did a video ranking all of their studio albums. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the tier list playlist linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 2 album. And now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1980. Alright, my favorite album of 1980 is Gentlemen Take Polaroids by Japan. This album might not be as well known as some of the other records that made this list, but I think this is a fantastic and very underrated record to come from this very unique English band. This is their 4th album in their discography, and at this point their sound had shifted away from the new wave elements that were more prevalent in their earlier records, and now we get this interesting fusion of art rock, art pop, as well as avant pop and synth pop. And one of my favorite elements of this record is the wide variety of different types of synth sounds being used in the most tasteful way possible. And synth writing is something that I've always thought Japan did exceptionally well, but this particular record has some of my favorite synth sounds of any record that I've ever heard, and I just love the way they utilize them and layer them on top of the guitar parts. This album is 8 tracks long with 4 songs on each side, and it opens up with the title track, Gentlemen Take Polaroids, which is a song that features that perfect blend of pop and experimentation. The remainder of side 1 features 3 more tracks, 2 of which are titled Swing and My New Career, and again, both are utilizing very tasteful synthesizer sounds, but they also have some seriously groovy bass lines as well, and that is another element of the Japan sound that I have always loved. I think Mick Karn is a seriously underappreciated bass player, and this particular record features some of my favorite bass lines that he's written of the entire Japan discography. The other song on side 1 is titled Burning Bridges, and this one is mostly instrumental and takes on some really haunting and mysterious qualities, and I love the little detour that this track provides the album with, and it's the perfect song to set up the final track of side 1. Side 2 then delivers 4 more amazing tracks, opening up with the very intense and high energy Methods of Dance, a great way to kickstart side 2, and then that's followed by one of the most bizarre and awesomely unique covers that I've ever heard of a song called Ain't That Peculiar, written by Smokey Robinson and recorded by Marvin Gaye. This has got to be my favorite song on the album. When I initially heard it, I didn't even know that it was a cover because the way it's done is just so unorthodox. It's completely unrecognizable from the original version. The only thing that's staying the same is the lyrics, but everything else is just completely new. A new groove, a new set of chords. The melody has changed. Just everything about it is just completely different from the original recording. And like I said, when I first heard it, I didn't even know that it was a cover. And then when I looked into it, I was completely blown away at how unique of a cover this was. It's gotta be my favorite song on this record. And then after that, they take things down a bit with a piano-centered ballad titled Night Porter. And this is a beautiful stretched out track that really takes its time. And it sets up the final track so nicely, which is a song titled Taking Islands from Africa, which is a really nice conclusion to this very adventurous and very colorful album. So between the very unique songwriting, the production, the tasteful synth sounds, and the incredible bass lines, I think this resulted in the best album to come out of 1980. Of all of the records that I had gone through for this year, I will say this one is probably the most acquired taste, but if you're into more experimental art pop sorts of sounds, you very well might enjoy this album. So if it sounds like something that you would be interested in, definitely check it out. And again, I also did a video ranking all of Japan's studio albums, so if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on that, be sure to check out the tier list playlist, linked in the comments and the description. So that is my number 1 favorite album of 1980. So to recap, at number 5, we had Never Forever by Kate Bush. Number 4 was Black Sea by XTC. Number 3 was Super Trouper by ABBA. Number 2 was Remain in Light by Talking Heads. And number 1 is Gentlemen Take Polaroids by Japan. If you haven't heard any of these albums before and you check them out, please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to see what you think. And please let me know what your top 5 favorite albums are of 1980. I would love to see your lists. All right, that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 albums of 1981. I'll see you then. Take care.